Recording. Okay, there we go. All right, so I'm Nicole Bonds. If you aren't familiar with me, I am the Ed Tech Specialist here at Lincoln Intermediate Unit. You'll see my contact information is highlighted here if you need to reach out to me. There's a couple of slides here I'm actually going to skim over really quickly because of the fact that one of the slides that we typically go over at the beginning of our LearnOn webinars is the idea of best practices. But before I do that, I do want to highlight the fact that this is our entire team that has been working and collaborating for both our LearnOn website and for our LearnOn webinars. So all of these folks have contributed in one way or another in building, facilitating, and helping with this entire experience to moving online. Just so that you're aware, with the Zoom webinar and meeting norms, yes, there is a Q&A pod for you to post your questions. I have left the chat open though, so that should you need to, you can post into the chat due to the size of the attendees in this particular group. So keep in mind that's there, but your microphone and your camera have been disabled. You're welcome to post questions in the Q&A. You can try to do so in the chat though. If there's a lot of chatting, sometimes I kind of slip past my notice. So the Q&A is the best place for you to post the questions. I'll definitely have an extra eye there if there's a question that you have. And at the end, if you would like to raise your hand and have a comment or share anything, I can give you the ability to unmute your mic. And as a last reminder, at the end, you will be sent to the Act 48 credit link that will be shared with you for the completion of this piece. Just as a heads up that the Act 48 credit for this will be ending here at the end of this week. I really suggest you go back to the LearnOn website. On the homepage, there's some information about that. So a couple of webinar outcomes for today. Really, I just want to review and let's think about and have that reflecting time to assess where we are and where we're headed, where we've been, because I'd imagine over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, month, we've spent trying to get ourselves ready to move our learning online and facilitating the best learning practices with our students. I think a lot of us are possibly at that point where, okay, we got it and now we're rolling. And there's that moment of, well, what now? Or how do I maintain this? Or is there something else? Or what is it I need to be doing? And in some cases it was, let's build this plane while we're flying it, and maybe we need to take that pausing moment and say, okay, do I need to reassess like how I'm flying it at this point? So I do want to remind you that we do have a lot of resources on our best practices page, and that's linked right here. You can get to it through the slide deck, which I placed in the chat for you. So I've kind of, maybe not so jokingly, as the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13 has come and gone here over the past week or so, this has been our Apollo 13 moment, I think, in public education, where we have to say that this is this a successful failure, where we may have failed to complete the school year, but are we making it as successful as we possibly can? Are we learning from the experience that we are currently facing and what it means for our students and for us and what it tells us about education right now and about how students learn? So I'm going to come back to this idea. I really think when you think about and compare some of the things that we've experienced, the idea that this happened and so suddenly that many educators haven't had a chance to go back to their classrooms and even gather the materials that they left there to pack up for the summer, and some educators are looking at scheduling how to get back into the classroom to at least pick up their things. So I think in many ways it's very similar to Apollo 13. We may have left thinking, oh, you know, we'll go to the moon eventually, or, you know, this is just a minor glitch. And now we're focusing kind of in a situation where we had to turn around education in an entirely different way. We never ended up going to the moon. We never ended up really getting the opportunity to end this school year. So I think having a moment to think about how we can make this the most successful failure to finish the school year in some ways, I think is really important. How can we stop and reflect on how we made something that could have been really, really worse, as great as it has been. So as we think about it, just some of the things that I want to come back to that I reiterate from the beginning of our LearnOn webinar sessions include this idea from Dr. Brad Johnson, the idea that really this has been about building relationships before rigor, about grace before grades, and patience before programs, and love before lessons. And in the last couple weeks, thinking about how have our relationships truly changed. In some ways, they may seem to have become strained? In other ways, how have they gotten stronger between colleagues, between administrators, between educators and their students? How have they struggled? But also, you might be surprised when you start to think and reflect, even if we're not quite to that reflecting point, where those relationships have become stronger for this. When have we looked at something and you said, you know what, this isn't about the grade anymore? And what does that tell us about the future of education? When we really look at the future of education, if we're not looking at that grade anymore right now, what does that tell us about how we're going into next year? And having that pause, that time to reflect on that. What does it tell us when we have spent more time with it, the idea of patience and not pushing the program? What has it told us about the programs that maybe we've had in place? Maybe why we've had them in place? To think and reflect on that. And the idea of what has really been our driving force as we've moved to online. Has it been about making sure we get to all of our lessons? Or has it really been about that moment of love and missing our students, our colleagues in our classroom? So I think we also need to come back to that. So having that moment to pause and reflect, I think, is really important. And that moment to kind of check ourselves about where we're headed and where we currently are. So some of us may find that we're here, like the squirrel, we might be at this point. And I think a lot of us were maybe there at least the first week to moving online. We found that our mailbox was like this. So kind of coming back to some of those best practices, such as the communication. Stopping to say, all right, where are we with our communication at this point? At this point, hopefully you have a telecommunication process set up, or a protocol that, you know, this is how we communicate with each other, with our students' parents. The idea of putting our own mask on first, I think, is important. When speaking with a lot of my fellow educators, I've asked them what some of their major stressors have been, and one of them has been that mailbox being full of parents, students, etc. So I think it's important to come back to the idea of what boundaries have you set? Now that we've hopefully gotten to the point where we're beginning to teach online, maybe we have more than a week under our belts, what communication protocols are working for you and what are not? Have you made it clear about when you're accessible to your colleagues, to your students' parents, and to your students? Or do they expect you to jump at a moment's notice to help problem solve for them? Setting that clear communication boundary is important, not just for you, but for them, so that they understand that, yeah, you're not going to necessarily respond to every email within 30 minutes, especially when they might be at 2 a.m. on a Friday night. So setting those boundaries and saying, I will do my best to get back to you within 24 to 48 hours, and making that clear expectation known might be important for them, but it's also important for you as a professional to make sure that it's clear, like, these are my boundaries, and this is why I have these boundaries. Now that we're up and running to a certain extent for many of us, recommunicating those boundaries may be an important place to kind of go back to and check yourself. So how are you communicating? Is it working, or does it need to be streamlined? Do you need to offer office hours? Are students coming to Zoom meetings that you're setting up? And if they aren't, do you continue for the students who are setting it up? Having that moment to reflect on, is this communication effective and is it working? And then going back to your district protocol, are you following what your district has set out as the protocol? Are you using the resources that they've set and said, hey, you need to be using Google Meets, you need to be using Zoom? Going back to that and saying, is it effective? Also taking a moment to reflect on where we are socially and emotionally. A lot of times when dealing with crisis, we have a couple of different ways of dealing with it. Some of us, maybe when dealing with crisis, go into ultra control, overpower mode, where we want to get everything done and it all needs to be done, not just yesterday, it needs to be done the day before that. So that we find that we're overworking ourselves, while some of us do the opposite. We may shut down a little bit, withdraw, and be like, I don't know why I don't have any energy to do anything. So taking a moment to think about that for yourself on a personal level, and think about what that means to your students and your colleagues. Are they also possibly in that place? And stopping and coming back to the best we can, because now that the newness of moving online has worn off for some people, that idea of patience that I shared with you may also be wearing off. Are you coming back to and revisiting the idea of patience? And that we are maybe 2 weeks in, but still just doing the best we can. So think about how you can meet those needs. Think about how you can continue to be present, to be silly, to be yourself, how you can let your students know that you're still there, even if you're not there on a synchronous level, maybe on an asynchronous level. Coming back to the idea of offering feedback instead of scores when you can. That goes back to like grace before grades. If you are scoring, are you offering more than just a grade? Are you offering more than just the A or the 89? Are you saying, hey, I really appreciate you taking the time to complete this assignment? How are you offering that feedback, and how could you offer it more frequently if possible? Are you having extra surprises? I've spoken with several people who are extra surprised that some of their students are thriving in this experience. Students who maybe never completed work before are suddenly completing work. Students who are always distracted in class aren't distracted at home when it's really clearly outlined what it is they need to be doing. What does that mean? What does that say about how students learn? And maybe taking note of that. Additionally, what students are surprisingly struggling? That if they were in the classroom, they always had their work done. They were always on it. And maybe when they log in, or if they log in, you're not hearing from them. What extra steps can you do to touch base with them? Just similarly, what extra steps can you do to touch base with the students who are surprisingly thriving? Are you having that conversation with your students? Hey, you seem like you really got a knack for this. Why would you say this is working for you? And having that moment to reflect could really lead to some powerful conversations going into the next school year. So taking that moment to pause, take a breath and say, okay, what has really surprised me the most about what's going on here? And how do your students think their needs are being met? Have they reached out to you? And if they aren't, can you reach out to them and find out how they feel their needs are or are not being met in this new environment? So I kind of want to take a moment to think about this idea of what is essentially executive dysfunction that can happen. Executive dysfunction, here I have it defined as the inability to self-regulate, manage time, prioritize, focus, remember details, start and complete tasks. And I think initially you look at it and you say, oh yes, I have those students. And you may have those students who are like that quite often. And you might have students who are suddenly reaching this point of executive dysfunction. And then I think more personally, we have to ask ourselves, am I reaching this point of executive dysfunction due to the stress of managing so many different hats, of being an educator, as well as a parent and a teacher at home to my student at home, as well as the teacher online, as well as, pretty much the household manager, etc. Taking a moment to realize that this might be a reality for some students and some of your colleagues, as well as yourself at this point, that you have maybe reached executive dysfunction. Some of the things that I normally remember like that, it's not sticking anymore. And I've reached that point where I can reflect and say, you know what, it's not just me. Everyone around me is also starting to reach a point, if they haven't already, of this ability to focus that might be falling away, the details, the ability to complete tasks. You might start one and not finish it when you would normally finish it. So coming back to that, thinking about how we can accommodate that for our learners, I think is really important when we move to online learning. So this is where I come back to the idea of organizing and sequencing. When we can keep everything in one location, it's really going to help with that executive dysfunction idea. Then I don't have to worry about, oh no, what was I supposed to do next? Or where was I supposed to go? Or I can't. And again, we're not just saying about this with our students. We're saying that about us. We're saying this for their parents. A lot of individuals are reaching that point where the ability to focus and keep all of the ducks in a row is really, really difficult. So where is the one place that you're posting it? And really, are you posting it once per week? Here's what the expectation is for the week, so that everyone knows where it is and the timeline that it's going to be posted. Keeping your expectations, objectives, and success criteria super clear is going to help with this. All right, here are the objectives, and here's how you demonstrate success. Put it up there at the beginning. Here are the objectives for the week. Here's how you're going to demonstrate you're successful with those. Identifying clearly who is going to do what. The student is going to log into whenever you possibly can, and when, and how long is it going to take? All right, if I log in and say, okay, that's going to take me 5 minutes, then I know how I can piecemeal my time. And maybe I'm not as like, oh, well, I don't know how long that's going to take, so I'm not going to start it. So keeping that idea of when something is going to be done. Numbering the steps is so important. When you think about that idea of executive dysfunction, creating checklists and numbering steps is going to help all of your students as well as your educators. It helps everyone keep everything organized so that they can clearly say, okay, I did 1, I did 2, I did 3, I did 4. Keeping it simple and keeping the steps under 5 or 6 whenever possible is going to help your students. If students are looking at a checklist of over 25 items for the week, that's overwhelming for anyone, not just a student. I think an adult given a checklist of 25 items would feel at this point overwhelmed. Keeping it small and chunked, but also checklisted and numbered is really going to help your students. I've also included a link down here to the Allison Yang's wayfinding document, the Oreo document that we've suggested that includes a lot of this information. The wayfinding document includes a space for objectives, success criteria, the idea of responsibility, who is doing what and when and how long it's going to take, and the numbered steps and the adding of the checklist at the end to really help you organize and sequence. I cannot stress enough how important this is going to be for everyone as we continue to kind of come to terms with the situation. So the next question that I've heard a lot of educators talking about is the idea of engagement, that they're, okay, I put my stuff online, but nobody's logging in. And they're not just saying this about students that we're not certain if they have the access, but they're saying this about students like, I know the student has the access. I know they could be doing this. Why aren't they doing it? So this is kind of that next step piece, like, okay, I'm starting to get my work online. What can I do to increase the engagement of my students when they're online? And some of these ideas come from, I have it linked down here at the bottom of an article from award-winning online instructors and why they're award-winning. It's one of the reasons is because of the level of engagement that they offer to their students. So when it comes to engagement, the idea of creating authentic learning experiences, offering a lot of variety in the learning experiences, keeping them as entertaining as possible, which I know sometimes we have to stop and say, look, I am not the circus ringleader, but trying to keep that element of entertainment is important. Creativity and offering creative opportunities for our students, as well as choice and voice. So I'm going to kind of go through these with some questions for reflection as we start to think about how we're moving online and how we can implement these elements into our online instruction. So the first one is authenticity. It's really about how we can connect the work that our students are doing to the world right now. And I know that that can be a challenge, especially when we think about those stressors. And if we really want to move to that discussion that we want to have students having, do they really want to be having that discussion about, you know, the crisis that's going on right now? That's a question that you need to ask yourself, knowing your students. You know your students best. So the idea of, hey, my students are ready to talk about this now, or maybe we're not quite there yet, is a discussion that you need to have. But the world is still going on. So there are plenty of ways to connect with the world. How can you connect with what a student is currently, what they're doing with what they're currently experiencing? How does it connect to real world problems? Even if we're not talking about necessarily the virus, there are plenty of other real world problems going on right now. How can you connect the work that they're doing to a different problem? Earth Day was last week. How could you connect it to Earth Day? How could you share the content in a way that reveals why it's relevant to the world? When you list your objectives, can you make that clear? Like, the reason you're learning this is because it deals with this that's going on right now, and give them that opportunity to explore that real world connection. So making the learning authentic, connecting it to the real world, a lot of times when students are dealing with everything else going on, having that opportunity to connect and say, oh, this is why this is relevant. I do have a voice. I do have the power to affect the world. And this does connect to what's going on right now, can drive a student or motivate a student to complete a task or take interest in a subject or topic. Additionally, the idea of variety helps motivate a lot of students. How are you structuring each lesson each week? There is an element of, yes, you want to have those objectives, and yes, you want to have the checklist, and yes, you want to have it numbered, but are they going to different places, or are you sending them to the same location over and over and over again? Are they only reading articles in one platform? Are they only reading articles? So the idea of giving that variety and having them have the opportunity to experience multiple viewpoints. If you're going to show one thing, can you show the opposing viewpoint so that maybe the student can experience both viewpoints or both sides? Or can they maybe experience different ways of learning it? If you're going to teach one equation, maybe you're going to use Khan Academy, but maybe you also want to find a description that's an article that explains the application of the equation. So thinking about how you can include that variety or offer more than one medium of expression. So yes, I would like you to respond to this You can use Flipgrid. Here's the location that you can use Flipgrid. You can use Google Doc, you can use Google Slide, and giving them that opportunity to have that variety of choice, of change, might also inspire them to engage more often. Can you keep it entertaining? Maybe you want to bribe them with, you know what, every time everybody logs in and does X, Y, and Z, I'm going to show you a new picture of my cat or my dog. That might be enough to entice some students, but you might need to make it novel and fun. Can you make something funny or humorous? Does it contain elements of a game? Is the feedback immediate in some cases? Is there an element of leveling, like, oh, she just leveled up because she completed, you know, the Flipgrid and now she's a level 25. The idea of points or creating fun competition. And then some students, and I know this from being a middle school teacher, they live for the social aspect. So, you know, if I get everybody to log in and do X, Y, and Z this week, we're gonna have a social Friday where everybody can show up and wear their favorite hat, or something silly, but also social, where they get to see each other and interact with each other. The idea of creating those opportunities can also help drive students. Including creativity. Creativity is giving the students to create content, not just consume it. I think sometimes this is difficult because we say, oh, you need to read this, you need to view this, you need to learn this. But the student then doesn't have a chance to try to create something that looks like that. And the opportunity to have that creation may drive some students to engage, so that instead of, you know, everybody just throwing everything at me, I'm overwhelmed, that opportunity to express what they're really thinking, their own ideas and their thoughts, can be very, very important, especially at this time. So think about how your students are showing you, not just telling you how they understand. Ask them to create a picture that demonstrates how they're feeling right now, about a topic or about their current situation at home. If you could illustrate what the last 2 weeks have been at home on a Google slide deck using appropriate pictures and shapes, what would you illustrate? So thinking about those elements of creativity, even if you just weave it in occasionally, that gives the students an opportunity to express themselves. And having that multiple means of expressing something means that they might be able to show you an understanding that you didn't expect, didn't know, and didn't anticipate. So that might also be another way to engage students. The idea of choice, and really there's kind of two ways of looking at choice. Do they have a choice in how they consume the content? And you're saying, hey, you can watch this video, you can read this article, you can listen to this podcast, or you can do it this way and follow a Twitter hashtag, perhaps. Think about how they choose what they consume. And do students get to choose how they're showing you their understanding, or are they perhaps always doing a Google form every week? So this comes back to variety too. You'll notice a lot of these overlap. And similarly, how they choose to show their understanding may also overlap with creativity. So often, if you choose one of these engagement strategies, you may find you're overlapping into others. I don't think by any means anyone at this point should be looking at all of these engagement strategies and saying, I must do them all, because that is completely overwhelming. But if you're looking for maybe a thread, just including choice is a really easy thread to weave in, and you might find that it overlaps into other engagement strategies as well. And the same with voice. Do they have a chance to tell you what they think? That comes back to creativity as well. Can they offer suggestions to you? Do you have a suggestion box? That sounds pretty crazy online, but maybe they have cool ideas. They may know stuff online that we don't. In fact, I'm willing to bet a lot of them know a lot of different things that we don't, where they could offer a suggestion to make it a little more fun or make it a little more engaging. Maybe they have a suggestion for your office hours. Maybe everyone's going to wear the same color, or their favorite football team or their favorite baseball team. Ask them to give you some suggestions if you're finding that, I don't know what to do, I feel like I've exhausted all of my ideas. Ask them to communicate with you. How are they communicating with their classmates? How are they communicating with the world? The idea of voice really, it expands. They communicate at home, and they might, in many cases, be feeling, hey, I'm trapped here. The only way out I might have is my social media, or just coming to class, or maybe there's no way out at all. So giving them the opportunity to communicate with beyond their classroom with their voice is even more important, when you can find those opportunities to share what they're thinking with the world, even if it's anonymously, sharing what your students are thinking with the world, so that you're not necessarily attaching a student's name or face. Think about how you can do that to empower the students to feel like they have a voice. And how do your students get that chance to communicate? How do they feel empowered right now? Because now is a time where I think a lot of us aren't feeling very empowered. And I'm sure that's true for your students. what chances of empowerment are you offering to them, and how can you amplify that idea? So coming back to our content, that's one of the locations we can make choice. So I just want to remind you best practices, because that's what this particular piece is about, is to try to keep those videos under 6 minutes and chunk them. So that, again, that comes back to even the executive dysfunction. When you can chunk things and keep them short, that really helps with that and allows students to go through the assignment the way that you intended. And when you can make a choice, it doesn't necessarily mean that the student has to read an article. Can you find a podcast on a similar topic and a video, and not say, hey, I need you to do all of these. I'd like you to choose one, because you might be surprised the students who are like, you know what, I don't want to watch the video. I actually just want to read the article, or vice versa. We also want to take into consideration, best practice-wise, what works with bandwidth. And by offering choices in voice and content and creativity, we can make sure that we are allowing the opportunity for students to pick the option which best fits their bandwidth situation. I know this morning for me, my bandwidth was terrible. I couldn't even do a Zoom call. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do the webinar this morning. And if I had a choice when my learning and said, okay, you can either record this or you can do a discussion board, I would have chosen a discussion board because I can't get the video to work. That's probably better than just saying I need it in a Flipgrid video, in which case I wouldn't have been able to respond, and I would have sent you an email and said, hey, Mrs. Myers, I can't respond, my bandwidth is really bad, but I can send you this email with a comment. And so having that choice not only mitigates that situation and gives me an option around bandwidth, it also might save your email box from multiple responses, and also saves me the stress of, I want to get this assignment in, but I can't. So thinking about bandwidth when you offer those choices might be another option as well. And then we come back to the reality of time. So a lot of us right now have probably stopped and said, okay, we are not covering it all. And that's okay. We're moving on with planned instruction, but you're not going to cut it all. Take whatever you thought you were going to do and cut it in half. And these are the recommended guidelines for the amount of time students should probably be spending learning online from the Continuous Learning Task Force. It's just recommendations. It's from the state of Kansas. So I am going to put it up here just as a reminder about how long students might be looking at. And I just want to remind everyone that 3 hours max per day isn't per subject. 3 hours max per day is max per day. So students, really 30 minutes per teacher in grades 6 through 12 per day is a good bit of work. And the same goes even as you go down through the elementary grades. And to keep in mind, again, we're all a little stressed and pushed a little thin here. So when you think about how much time and how much work you're asking from students, keep that in mind. Also, you have the idea of the new home life. I can speak from experience that I have a stepson. So not only are we trying to figure out stepson-wise where he is and where he is with his assignments with his teacher and his mom, but then we also have to figure out what's going on this end. So when he goes back and forth between homes, we're trying to figure out, all right, what did he do? What did he not do? How can we keep a checklist of that for the teacher, for mom, and for dad? And that can be a struggle for any family that's dealing with that, on top of any number of other issues of mom and dad working from home and maybe 3 or 4 other siblings. So when you do think about how you're using time with students or how much work you're giving, those are all considerations that we still have to keep in the back of our mind, even as it might seem that this train is finally on the tracks and it's finally moving. Don't stop, always stop and pause and ask yourself, okay, are my students, do they still have the time to complete this, and where might they be with the idea of the new home life? When it comes to pedagogy is king, what have we converted well and what we haven't converted well? Always come back to the right tool. Today, I'm not going to go into the details of tools, but I am going to remind you that we have a number of recorded webinars that we have saved for you. If you are interested in learning more about any number of tools, or how to move discussion online, or how to move lectures online, all of those webinars are available on our LearnOn website, as well as on the YouTube channel. And you can still get Act 48 through this week, even if you go back and watch webinars from the past, including this one. And to consider design, when you are designing your lessons, I would like to remind you to begin with empathy. Put yourself in your shoes whenever possible. And if you can, model your expectations. Explain what your thinking is, as well as what the work is supposed to be. And for many of you, I think assessment may turn into feedback more so than actual assessment. So when we start to think about where we are, the other thing I would like to remind you is to prioritize your reflection. What have you not covered? What have you documented it somewhere? Have you documented what you've covered versus what you haven't? And can you create a quick list? I would say create a quick list of where you are, where you think you're going to be, of the standards and the concepts not covered this year. This is going to be really, really valuable moving into next year because then it's something that you can hand off. Additionally, have you reached out to the teacher before you, so to speak, the one that would have the students you would probably have next year? And are they creating a list for you? Have you asked them, hey, you know, I appreciate it, I know you're doing some hard work. Let's get together at the end of this year and talk about, you know, where this is, what information I might need to cover again because you didn't get to it. It isn't a blame game. Nobody's going to be able to cover all this information. It's really about, okay, where am I going to need to start next year? So creating a list just of, hey, this is what I covered and this is what I didn't get to that I would have covered at the end of the year is really going to help you moving into next year. It's kind of that next steps. Now that we're rocking and rolling, what is it that I'm not going to be able to do? And that's okay that I'm not going to be able to do it. I just need to make sure I communicate it. So I'm going to come back to the idea of Apollo 13. And that a lot of us might have been looking at this particular move to online learning, especially 2-3 weeks ago, as a little bit of a panic mode. The idea of we have failed the school year, or I am failing my students because I am moving online, or any number of iterations of that. And that a lot of times that some of our greatest learning comes from those moments where it looks like it might be an epic fail, but it really isn't. It's a successful fail. So reflect on what has worked for you so far and to think about it a little bit like maybe NASA thought about Apollo 13, that really it has been about getting everyone safely home in certain ways, and that we're going to reflect on this and probably see things that we can go back and fix based upon how things happened so far. In fact, some of you might already have lists like, oh, I know what I'm doing the next time this comes up, and you already have lists. So we need to celebrate how that has been successful, and not just focus on the fact that, you know what, we lost the school year. It is sad, and it's definitely not where we wanted to be, but the idea of being successful anyway, I think is really, really important. So again, I'm going to remind you, we have a best practices page that has a lot of resources on it. Please feel free to visit the page to look for some of those resources, as well as the slide deck that has the Allison Yang document in it. You are welcome to reach out to me. We have been including on our webinar list on the LearnOn page a lot of webinars from different entities. I think I have some Common Lit on there. There's some Apple webinars. There's some Discovery Education webinars. Don't hesitate to go and check. We've been adding to it kind of as the weeks have been going on. Anytime we see a resource that we know our districts are using and our educators are using, we're trying to include the webinars in there. We may not offer Act 48 for them, but if you're looking to train up on a particular tool, it's a great resource to go back and look at. I really appreciate everything that everyone is doing with education right now. I'll take a moment if anybody has any questions that they want to populate in the Q&A. I'm more than willing to field any questions. You can also reach out to me at nabond@iu12.org. I will be happy to reply to any of your emails. As we wrap up today, the LearnOn web eval is right up here if you are looking to do an evaluation. And as we finish up, this will push you out to Act 48 to fill out for your Act 48 credit. Again, I really appreciate all of you being here today, and I hope you have a wonderful remainder to the day.